Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're diving into something that's going to make you question everything you think. You know about family connections and the invisible threads that bind us across time and distance? We're talking about people who found lost relatives, parents, children, siblings they'd never met, through dreams that were so vivid, so specific that they led to real-world reunions that shouldn't have been possible. So go ahead and hit that like button if you're in the mood for some seriously mind-bending family stories, and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy these late-night journeys into the weird corners of human experience. Don't just do it because I asked, do it because you actually want to hear more of these bizarre tales that make you wonder. If reality is way stranger than we pretend it is during daylight hours, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your part of the world. Are you in bed? On a couch? Pretending to work while actually falling asleep to stories about supernatural family reunions? Drop a comment and let me know. It's always fascinating to see how these strange stories travel across the globe to find people who need to hear them. You know what really gets me about these stories? They suggest that family bonds might be stronger than physics, more persistent than geography, and more powerful than time itself. Like love creates its own gravitational field that can pull people together across impossible distances, even when they're asleep. Anyway, let's start with what might be the most documented case of dream-guided family reunion in modern history. A story that involves a mother who spent 43 years looking for her son, only to find him through a dream that was so detailed it basically came with a street address. Picture this, it's 1943. And 17-year-old Margaret Sullivan is giving birth in a Catholic home for unwed mothers in Boston. The nuns tell her that her baby boy will go to a good family and that she should forget this ever happened, move on with her life, and never speak of it again. Because apparently, in 1943, the solution to teen pregnancy was just pretending it never happened. Like emotional amnesia was a legitimate life strategy. I mean, can you imagine being 17 years old? Going through childbirth, and then being told by a bunch of nuns and starched habits that you should just erase this experience from your memory like it was a typo in a letter. Margaret held that baby for exactly 3 minutes before they took him away. 3 minutes. She counted every second, memorizing his tiny face, the way his fingers curled around hers, the sound of his first cry. And then nothing, gone like he'd never existed. Margaret tries to follow their advice. She gets married to a decent man named Paul, who knows about the baby, but promises never to mention it. She has 3 other children, 2 daughters and a son, who all grow up knowing they have a mysterious older brother somewhere in the world. She builds what looks like a perfectly normal suburban life in Medford, Massachusetts. But every single night for 43 years, and I mean every single night, she dreams about a little boy with her eyes and her stubborn chin. Now, most people would probably dismiss these as just anxiety dreams or maternal guilt manifesting in sleep. But Margaret's dreams were different. They were ridiculously, impossibly specific. She dreamed about the boy, who she'd named Thomas in her heart, after her own father, living in specific houses in specific neighborhoods that she'd never visited. She saw him playing with particular toys that she could describe down to the color of the plastic and the shape of the wheels. In her dreams, Margaret watched Thomas take his first steps in a kitchen with yellow, linoleum floors and a refrigerator covered in alphabet magnets. She saw him start kindergarten at a school with red brick walls and a playground with 2 slides, one tall, one short. She dreamed about him losing his first tooth while eating an apple at a kitchen table made of dark wood. And she watched his adoptive mother, a woman with short brown hair and kind eyes, comfort him when he cried about the blood. The really weird part? Margaret had never been to most of the places she dreamed about. She saw Thomas growing up in a suburb of Detroit that she'd never visited, attending Roosevelt Elementary School whose architecture she could describe in detail despite never having seen a photograph of it. She dreamed about him working at an auto parts store called Mickey's that sold Valvoline oil and had a particular bell that rang when customers opened the door, a brass bell with a wooden handle that made a sound like a small church bell. For 4 decades, Margaret collected these dream details like a detective building a case file on a missing person. She kept journals, dozens of spiral notebooks filled with descriptions of houses, schools, jobs, even the names of Thomas's friends and teachers. She wrote down that his best friend in third grade was a kid named Jimmy Rodriguez who had a gap between his front teeth. She recorded that his high school girlfriend was named Linda Peterson and that she had blonde hair that she wore in a ponytail with a blue ribbon. Margaret's husband, Paul, thought she was obsessing over something that was preventing her from moving forward with their actual family. Their other children worried that she loved this phantom son more than she loved them. Her daughter Carol once asked her, "Mom, why do you spend more time writing about Thomas than you spend talking to us?" And honestly, Margaret didn't have a good answer. She couldn't explain that the dreams felt more real than her waking life sometimes. The dreams weren't just visual, either. Margaret could smell the chalk dust in Thomas's classroom at Roosevelt Elementary. She could hear the specific sound of his laughter, kind of a cross between a giggle and a snort, exactly like her own father used to laugh. She could feel the texture of his hair when she hugged him in the dreams, soft and thick, with a cowlick on the left side that made it stick up no matter how much his adoptive mother tried to smooth it down. It was like she was watching his entire life unfold from some invisible balcony seat, close enough to see everything but too far away to actually participate. She watched him struggle with math in fourth grade, saw him break his arm falling off his bike when he was 9, witnessed his first day of high school when he was so nervous he threw up in the boys' bathroom before first period. Margaret's dream journals became incredibly detailed family histories of people she'd never met. She wrote about Thomas's adoptive parents, Frank and Helen Patterson, describing their personalities, their jobs, even their quirks. Frank worked at Ford Motor Company and always came home with grease under his fingernails. Helen taught piano lessons in their living room and made the best chocolate chip cookies in the neighborhood. They were good people who loved Thomas as if he were their biological son. But Margaret could sense in her dreams that Thomas always felt slightly out of place, like something was missing. The dreams evolved as Thomas grew up. Margaret watched him graduate from high school, saw him struggle to find his direction in life, witnessed him working various jobs while trying to figure out what he wanted to do with himself. She dreamed about him meeting a woman named Patricia who would become his wife, watched their wedding ceremony in a small church with stained glass windows that cast blue and red light across the altar. She saw Thomas become a father himself, first a daughter named Jennifer, then a son named Michael. Margaret dreamed about being a grandmother to children she'd never hold, watching them take their first steps, hearing their first words, seeing them play in the same backyard where their father had grown up. The emotional pain of witnessing these family milestones as a spectator rather than a participant was almost unbearable. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Margaret's dreams was watching Thomas search for her. Starting when he was in his early 20s, Margaret began dreaming about Thomas sitting in libraries, looking through adoption records, calling government offices, hiring private investigators. She saw the frustration on his face when he hit dead ends, witnessed the determination in his eyes when he refused to give up hope of finding his birth mother. In her dreams, Thomas would stare at his reflection in mirrors, wondering who he looked like, what traits he'd inherited, what his medical history might be. Margaret watched him fill out forms at adoption agencies, saw him spend hours on the phone with bureaucrats who couldn't or wouldn't help him access information about his biological family. The bureaucratic obstacles that prevented their reunion were like watching someone try to solve a puzzle with half the pieces deliberately hidden. Margaret tried everything to make the dream stop, or at least become less emotionally intense. She went to therapy, where a well-meaning counselor suggested she was using the dreams to avoid dealing with her feelings of guilt and loss. She tried medication, but the dreams persisted even through pharmaceutical fog. She considered joining support groups for birth mothers. But how do you explain to other women that you've been watching your son's entire life unfold in your dreams for 4 decades? Her marriage suffered under the weight of her obsession with Thomas. Paul loved Margaret, but he couldn't compete with a ghost son who occupied so much of his wife's emotional energy. Their other children grew up feeling like they were always being compared to this perfect phantom brother who existed only in their mother's dreams. The family dynamic became increasingly strained as Margaret became more withdrawn and focused on her dream journals. Then in 1986, when Margaret was 60 years old and had been having the Thomas dreams for 43 years, something changed. Instead of the usual dreams about his daily life, she started having dreams about Thomas searching for her with new intensity and urgency. She saw him sitting in adoption agencies with a desperate expression she'd never seen before, witnessed him hiring a more expensive private investigator, watched him spending his savings on searches that had previously been casual inquiries. In the dreams, Thomas seemed to be running out of patience with the slow, bureaucratic process of searching through official channels. Margaret saw him driving to different cities, knocking on doors of adoption agencies, demanding to see records that had been sealed for decades. There was something different about his approach, more determined, more desperate, like he was racing against some invisible deadline. The breakthrough dream came on a Tuesday night in March 1986. Margaret dreamed that Thomas was standing in front of a house she'd never seen before, a specific house with blue shutters and a crooked mailbox shaped like a tiny barn. The house was in a neighborhood that looked like suburban Detroit, with older trees and sidewalks cracked by decades of winter freezing and spring thawing. In the dream, Thomas was talking to an elderly woman with white hair who was watering flowers in the front yard. The woman was Asian, maybe Chinese or Japanese, and she was wearing a floral housecoat and pink slippers. She had the patient, grandmotherly demeanor of someone who enjoyed talking to strangers, especially young people who reminded her of her own children or grandchildren. The conversation in Margaret's dream was incredibly specific. Thomas asked the woman, "Excuse me, I'm looking for someone. My birth mother might have called here asking about me. Her name is Margaret Sullivan, and she would have given birth to me in Boston in 1943. The elderly woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Dorothy Chun, looked at Thomas with surprise and sympathy. "Oh, yes, dear," she said in the dream. "Your mother called here last week. Such a sweet lady. She sounded like she'd been looking for you for a very long time. She left her number and asked me to give it to you if you ever came around asking about her." Mrs. Chun disappeared into her house and returned with a piece of paper torn from a notebook. On it was written, in handwriting that Margaret somehow recognized as her own, Margaret Sullivan 617-555-2847. Margaret woke up with that phone number burned into her memory like someone had carved it into her brain with a laser. She could see it as clearly as if it had been written on paper in front of her. The problem? She'd never called anyone in Detroit. She'd never given that number to anyone. She didn't even know anyone named Dorothy Chun, and the phone number wasn't even hers. Her actual number was 617-555-1903, but the dream felt so real, so urgent, so emotionally charged that Margaret couldn't dismiss it as fantasy. There was something about the quality of the dream, the way the sunlight looked on Mrs. Chun's flowers, the sound of Thomas's voice when he said her name, the texture of the paper with the phone number, that felt more real than reality itself. Against all logic, common sense, and her husband's vigorous objections, Margaret got dressed at 6 in the morning and drove 400 miles to Detroit. She had no plan beyond finding a house with blue shutters and a crooked mailbox shaped like a barn, in a city of nearly 1 million people. Because apparently sometimes love makes you do things that look completely insane from the outside but feel absolutely necessary from the inside. Paul thought she'd finally lost her mind completely. "Margaret," he said as she packed a suitcase, "you're chasing dream phantoms. You're going to drive to Detroit and wander around looking for a house that probably doesn't exist, based on a conversation with an imaginary Chinese grandmother. Do you understand how this sounds?" But Margaret felt pulled toward Detroit with a force she couldn't explain or resist. It was like some invisible rope was attached to her heart and someone was reeling her in from 400 miles away. She told Paul she'd be back in a few days, kissed their confused children goodbye, and drove west with nothing but an address book, a thermos of coffee, and 43 years of accumulated maternal determination. Margaret spent 2 days driving through Detroit suburbs, looking for the house from her dream. She felt completely insane. She was a 60-year-old grandmother wandering around a strange city, searching for a house that might not even exist. based on a dream about a son she'd given up 43 years earlier. Every logical part of her brain was screaming that this was the behavior of someone having a psychological breakdown. But something kept pulling her forward, some magnetic certainty that she was in the right place at the right time for the first time in decades. She drove through neighborhood after neighborhood, looking at mailboxes, checking the color of shutters, feeling increasingly desperate and foolish with each passing hour. On Thursday afternoon, she found it. Blue shutters, crooked mailbox shaped like a tiny barn, elderly Asian woman watering flowers in the front yard. Margaret sat in her car for 20 minutes, trying to work up the courage to approach this stranger and basically announce that she was living out a dream that might be completely insane. The woman was exactly as Margaret had dreamed her. White hair pulled back in a small bun, floral housecoat, pink slippers, the patient demeanor of someone who had raised children and grandchildren and understood that life sometimes brings unexpected visitors to your front door. Finally, Margaret walked up to the woman and said, "This is going to sound absolutely crazy, but I think my son might have been here asking about me." The woman, Mrs. Dorothy Chun, just as in the dream, looked at Margaret like she'd seen a ghost. "Are you Margaret Sullivan from Boston?" "Yes, how did you?" "How did you know that? Because Thomas Patterson was here yesterday? He's been looking for you for 15 years. He left his phone number and said if a woman named Margaret Sullivan ever came around asking about him, I should give her this." Mrs. Chun handed Margaret a piece of paper with the exact phone number she'd dreamed about, 6175552847. It was Thomas's phone number, the number he'd been hoping his birth mother would somehow find. This next story is going to mess with your head because it involves a man dreaming about meeting his father for the first time, a father who died in a war before the dreamer was even born, in a place the dreamer had never been, speaking a language the dreamer didn't understand. But somehow, this impossible dream led to a real-world family connection that changed everything and solved a mystery that had haunted a family for over 50 years. Robert Kim was adopted from South Korea in 1953 when he was 2 years old. Part of that massive wave of war orphans who were scattered across American families after the Korean conflict tore that country apart. He grew up in Minneapolis with loving American parents, Harold and Betty Kim. Yes, they kept his Korean surname, who gave him every opportunity and advantage, but who knew absolutely nothing about his biological family beyond the basic information on his adoption papers. The paperwork was frustratingly sparse. Birth name: Kim Robert. Birth date: approximately March 10th, 1951. Parents: unknown. Medical history: none available. Place of origin: Seoul orphanage. That was it. Literally everything Robert knew about his first 2 years of life could fit on a 3x5 index card with room left over for a grocery list. Robert grew up knowing he was Korean but feeling completely American. He played baseball, ate hamburgers, spoke perfect English with a mild Midwestern accent, and never thought much about his biological family because, honestly, what was the point? His birth parents could be anywhere, could be anyone, could be dead. The Korean War had displaced millions of people and separated countless families permanently. The chances of ever finding his biological relatives seemed essentially zero. His adoptive parents were wonderful about acknowledging his Korean heritage without making it feel like an obligation. They celebrated Korean holidays they'd researched in library books, attempted to cook Korean food with varying degrees of success, and even took Robert to cultural events at the local Korean American Community Center. But it all felt academic rather than personal, like studying someone else's history rather than connecting with his own roots. Robert went to college, became an accountant, got married to a lovely woman named Jennifer who was also adopted, though from Irish Catholic origins rather than Korean war zones. They built a comfortable suburban life in St. Paul had 2 kids of their own, and Robert rarely thought about his biological family except during those quiet moments when he'd catch his reflection and wonder who he looked like, what traits he'd inherited, whether anyone back in Korea had his same stubborn cowlick or tendency to sneeze in bright sunlight. But starting when Robert was in his 30s, coincidentally around the same age, his biological father would have been during the Korean War, he began having the same dream repeatedly. In the dream, he was a young soldier fighting in mountainous terrain that looked nothing like Minnesota, but somehow felt familiar in a way that made his chest tighten with emotion he couldn't name. The landscape in these dreams was incredibly specific and vivid. Robert found himself scrambling up rocky hillsides covered with scrub brush and stunted trees, ducking behind boulder formations while artillery shells exploded close enough to shower him with dirt and rock fragments. He was carrying an M1 Garand rifle. He somehow knew the exact model even though Robert had never held a weapon in his life, and wearing a uniform that felt authentic down to the scratchy wool fabric and the weight of the ammunition clips on his belt. In the dream, Robert would find himself taking cover behind a particular rock formation, always the same rocks arranged in the same way, like a natural fortress overlooking a valley that stretched toward mountains in the distance. The view was breathtaking and terrifying at the same time, because while the landscape was beautiful, it was also filled with the sounds and chaos of active combat. Another soldier would crawl over and lie down beside him during the heaviest artillery bombardment, and they would have a conversation entirely in Korean, a conversation that Robert somehow understood perfectly in the dream but couldn't remember in detail when he woke up. What he could remember was the emotional content, fear mixed with determination, homesickness tempered by duty, and an overwhelming love for family members who were too far away to protect. What made the dream so vivid and emotionally devastating was the other soldier's face. Robert could see him clearly, a young man maybe 20 years old, with kind eyes and a serious expression who looked remarkably similar to Robert himself. Not identical, but clearly related. Same jawline, same eyebrows, same way of squinting slightly when concentrating. The soldier had the same hands as Robert, long fingers with square nails, and the same habit of touching his left ear when thinking carefully about something. The conversation between Robert and the mysterious soldier always followed the same pattern, like a script that had been rehearsed in some cosmic theater. The soldier would show Robert a black and white photograph that was creased from being carried in a wallet, a picture of a beautiful young woman who was obviously pregnant, smiling shyly at the camera while standing next to a small house with a traditional Korean curved roof. Then the soldier would point to Robert and nod, as if confirming something important. Robert understood in the dream that the pregnant woman was his mother, and that the soldier showing him the photograph was his father. The knowledge came not through words, but through a kind of emotional certainty that felt more real than any conscious thought Robert had ever experienced. The soldier would then take off a small metal pendant he was wearing around his neck, a simple piece of silver shaped like a Korean character Robert couldn't read, and press it into Robert's palm. The pendant was warm from the soldier's body heat, and Robert could feel its weight and texture with impossible clarity. The soldier would say something in Korean that Robert understood in the dream to mean, "Find your way home, my son. Remember where you come from." The dream would always end with the sound of incoming artillery, a whistling sound that grew louder and more ominous until Robert would wake up with his heart pounding and the taste of gunpowder in his mouth. Which was weird because Robert had never served in the military, had no experience with combat or warfare, and had certainly never tasted gunpowder. But the sensory memories from the dream were so vivid they lingered for hours after waking. For months, Robert dismissed these dreams as just his subconscious mind processing anxiety about his unknown family history. Maybe he'd seen too many Korean War movies, though actually he'd avoided war films because they made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't explain. Maybe his brain was creating fantasy scenarios about the father he'd never known, filling in the blanks of his personal history with dramatic fiction. But the dreams kept getting more specific and more emotionally powerful. Robert started recognizing details about the landscape that seemed too precise to be imagination. He could describe the exact shape of rock formations, the particular species of scrub brush growing on the hillsides, even the way the light looked at different times of day as it reflected off the mountains in the distance. The dreams also began affecting his waking life in unexpected ways. Robert found himself drawn to Korean War documentaries and history books, absorbing information about battles, equipment, and military procedures with an intensity that surprised his family. He started recognizing place names and geographical features that felt familiar from his dreams, even though he'd never studied Korean geography or military history. More disturbing, Robert began having emotional reactions to certain sounds and smells that reminded him of the dream experiences. The sound of jets flying overhead would make him instinctively duck, as if expecting artillery bombardment. The smell of certain metals or explosive materials would trigger intense feelings of fear and homesickness that seemed to belong to someone else's memories. Jennifer became concerned when Robert started waking up from the dream speaking Korean phrases he claimed not to know. She would find him muttering in what sounded like fluent Korean, having conversations with invisible people, calling out names she couldn't understand. When she asked him about it, Robert would have no memory of speaking Korean and would insist he didn't know more than a few basic words he'd learned from cultural events. The breakthrough came when Robert decided to research his adoption more seriously. He'd always assumed that finding information about his biological family would be impossible given the chaos of post-war Korea and the limited record-keeping of emergency adoptions. But his dreams had given him something he'd never had before, specific details that might be traceable through military archives. Robert hired a genealogist named Patricia Chung who specialized in Korean war-era adoptions and had connections with both American military records and Korean government archives. Patricia had helped dozens of Korean adoptees connect with their biological families, and she understood the unique challenges of researching family histories that had been disrupted by war and international adoption. When Robert described his dreams to Patricia, she didn't dismiss them as fantasy or wishful thinking. She'd worked with other adoptees who had recovered family information through dreams, and she understood that trauma and separation sometimes create unusual pathways for memory and connection. Patricia encouraged Robert to write down every detail he could remember from his dreams, no matter how strange or unlikely they seemed. After months of searching through archives and interviewing elderly Koreans who remembered the war, Patricia found a single document that changed everything. Robert's biological father was Kim Jong-soo, a South Korean soldier who had been killed in action in October 1951 near a place called Heartbreak Ridge, about 6 months before Robert was born. According to military records, Jong-soo had been part of the 2nd Infantry Division's desperate battle to hold strategic high ground against Chinese and North Korean forces. When Patricia showed Robert photographs of the Heartbreak Ridge area, he immediately recognized the landscape from his dreams. The rock formations, the valley views, even the specific ridgelines were exactly what he'd been seeing in his sleep for months. He was dreaming about the actual place where his father had died, despite never having seen photographs or maps of that location. The military records also revealed that Jong-soo had been carrying personal effects when his body was recovered, including a photograph of a pregnant woman identified as Kim Soo-jin, fiancé, and a small silver pendant inscribed with a Korean character meaning family. The photograph matched Robert's dream memories perfectly. Same shy smile, same traditional house in the background, same pose with hands resting on her pregnant belly. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery was a letter that Jong-soo had written to his unborn child just days before the battle where he died. The letter, preserved in military archives, was addressed to my son or daughter who I will never meet, and contained specific instructions about family traditions he wanted his child to maintain, along with expressions of love that were heartbreaking in their intensity and hope. Jong-soo had written, "If you are a son, I hope you will be strong but gentle, brave but wise. If you are a daughter, I hope you will be independent but loving, smart but kind. Either way, remember that you carry the blood of farmers and scholars, of people who survived wars and famines because they never forgot that family is stronger than any force that tries to separate us." The letter also contained information that confirmed details from Robert's dreams. Jong-soo described the exact view from his position at Heartbreak Ridge, mentioned the specific rock formation where he and his fellow soldiers had taken cover, and even wrote about conversations he'd had with other soldiers about their families back home. Everything matched Robert's dream experiences with impossible accuracy. Armed with this information and Patricia's research assistance, Robert decided to travel to South Korea and visit Heartbreak Ridge. It was 1995, over 40 years after the battle where his father had died, but Robert felt an overwhelming compulsion to see the place that had been appearing in his dreams with such vivid detail. The trip to Korea was emotionally overwhelming before Robert even reached Heartbreak Ridge. Walking through Seoul, seeing Korean faces that shared his features, hearing the language that he somehow understood in dreams but couldn't speak while awake, all of it felt like returning to a homeland he'd never known he'd lost. The trip to Heartbreak Ridge was surreal. Robert found himself walking through terrain that he recognized from his dreams, following paths he'd never seen but somehow knew by heart. The emotional impact was devastating. He felt like he was literally walking through his father's final experiences, seeing the war through eyes he'd inherited but memories he'd never lived. At the battle site, Robert met an elderly Korean man named Park Min-ho, who was visiting a memorial to his fallen comrades. Park was in his 70s, one of the few surviving members of Jong-soo's unit, and he had traveled from Seoul specifically to honor the friends he'd lost during that terrible battle over 50 years earlier. When Robert introduced himself and explained his connection to Jong-soo, Park began crying and said in broken English, "Your father talked about you every day. Every day he show us picture of your mother. Say, my son will be born soon. I teach him to be strong, to be proud of being Korean, to remember where he came from." Then Park did something that made Robert's knees weak with recognition and disbelief. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small metal pendant, the exact same pendant that the soldier in Robert's dreams had pressed into his palm. It was simple silver, inscribed with a Korean character, worn smooth from decades of handling. Park explained that Jong-soo had asked him to keep the pendant and somehow find a way to give it to his son if the child ever came looking for information about his father. Jong-soo had been superstitious about wearing it into battle, afraid it would be lost if something happened to him, so he'd entrusted it to Park with specific instructions about its significance. Jong-soo said his son would find his way home eventually, Park told Robert through tears. He believed that family connections are stronger than war, stronger than death, stronger than any distance. He said love creates its own navigation system, and someday his son would follow it back to where his story began. When Park placed the pendant around Robert's neck, something remarkable happened. The dream stopped. Not gradually, not slowly, but completely and immediately. It was as if his father's spirit had been trying to guide him to that exact place, to that exact meeting, to reclaim that exact piece of his family history. Once the mission was accomplished, the dreams were no longer necessary. Robert wore his father's pendant for the rest of the trip, and he began experiencing Korea differently. Instead of feeling like a foreign tourist, he felt like he was remembering a place he'd known in some other life. He started recognizing Korean words and phrases, understanding cultural customs that nobody had taught him, feeling connected to the country and its people in ways that went beyond genetics or nationality. When Robert returned to Minneapolis, he began studying Korean language and culture with the intensity of someone making up for lost time. He learned to read the inscription on his father's pendant. It meant remembrance of family. And he discovered that the pendant had been passed down through several generations of Kim men before reaching his father. Robert eventually moved his family to Seoul, where he started a nonprofit organization that helps Korean War orphans and adoptees connect with their biological families. His work has resulted in hundreds of family reunions, guided by the belief that love creates invisible threads between relatives that can survive any separation, any distance, and even death itself. The organization maintains a database of adoption records, military documents, and family histories that helps people piece together identities that were fractured by war. Robert often tells people that his father spent 40 years trying to guide him home, using dreams as a bridge between the living and the dead, between the present and the past, between a father's love and a son's need to understand where he came from. Robert never married again after Jennifer died of cancer in 2008, and he never had more children of his own. But he always said his real family was the network of adoptees and birth families he helped reconnect. He believed that his father had somehow reached across decades and death to guide him toward his true purpose, not just finding his own family story, but helping others find theirs. Sometimes the dead don't rest until they've finished their work, and sometimes that work is making sure love finds its way home, even when home is on the other side of the world. Sarah Mitchell grew up as an only child in suburban Ohio, but she spent her entire childhood having conversations with an invisible sister named Emma, who felt more real to her than most of her actual friends. Now, most parents would probably assume Emma was just a typical imaginary friend, the kind of fantasy companion that many children create to deal with loneliness, boredom, or the general weirdness of being a small human trying to figure out how the world works. Sarah's parents, David and Linda Mitchell, were practical, level-headed people who worked at the local bank and drove sensible cars and believed in things like balanced checkbooks and regular dental visits. They played along with Emma, setting an extra place at the dinner table sometimes, buying Christmas presents for Emma, even taking family photos where they'd leave space for Sarah's invisible sister because, hey, parenting in the 1980s was all about supporting your child's creativity, right? But Emma wasn't like other imaginary friends that kids usually conjure up. She wasn't a magical unicorn or a superhero or some fantastical creature with wings and rainbow powers. Emma was remarkably normal, boringly, consistently, persistently normal. She had consistent personality traits, specific preferences that never changed, and detailed memories of experiences she and Sarah had supposedly shared that were way too complex and emotionally nuanced for a 7-year-old to invent. Emma liked strawberry ice cream but hated chocolate, and hated it with the kind of passionate disgust that kids usually reserve for Brussels sprouts or having to go to bed early. She was afraid of thunderstorms but loved rainy days, which is oddly specific when you think about it. She had a distinctive laugh that Sarah could imitate perfectly, a kind of snorting giggle that started quietly and then built up to something that sounded like a small engine trying to start. Most remarkably, Emma seemed to age alongside Sarah, developing new interests and concerns that matched each stage of childhood development. When Sarah was 8 and obsessed with horses, Emma was also obsessed with horses, but with different favorite breeds. When Sarah was 10 and starting to notice boys, Emma was also starting to notice boys, but she had crushes on different kids at school. It was like Emma was living a parallel childhood that intersected with Sarah's but remained distinctly separate. Sarah's conversations with Emma were incredibly detailed and emotionally complex. They would discuss everything from playground politics to family dynamics, sharing secrets and fears the way real sisters might. Sarah often felt like Emma understood her better than anyone else in her family, providing comfort during difficult times and celebrating her successes with genuine enthusiasm that felt more authentic than the polite encouragement she got from adults. But here's where Emma starts to become genuinely weird rather than just imaginatively impressive. Emma would describe family vacations to places Sarah had never visited, talk about relatives Sarah had never met, and reference family traditions that didn't exist in the Mitchell household. When Sarah asked her parents about these things, they would look confused and suggest that Sarah was mixing up Emma's imaginary life with reality. Emma would tell Sarah detailed stories about their birth, describing a hospital room with green curtains, a nurse with red hair who cried when the babies were separated, and the specific sound of medical equipment beeping in the background. She talked about how they had shared the same space before being born, how they had communicated without words, and how being separated felt like having half of herself torn away. These stories felt like memories to Sarah, even though her parents assured her they were completely fabricated. David and Linda Mitchell had very clear memories of Sarah's birth. Linda had gone into labor at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. They had driven to Mercy General Hospital, and after 8 hours of labor, Sarah had been born healthy and alone. No twins, no separations, no traumatic family secrets. Just one perfectly normal baby girl who apparently had an overactive imagination. But Emma's descriptions of their supposed shared infancy were incredibly specific and emotionally consistent. She described how they used to sleep curled up against each other, how they would kick and move in synchronized patterns, how they could sense each other's emotions before they even understood what emotions were. Sarah found these stories deeply comforting, like Emma was filling in missing pieces of her identity that she didn't even know were absent. When Sarah was 16, her relationship with Emma began to change in ways that were both comforting and deeply unsettling. Instead of just talking during the day like they had throughout childhood, Emma started appearing in Sarah's dreams, and these dream encounters felt more real than their waking conversations had ever been. It was like Emma had found a way to become more present and vivid by accessing Sarah's subconscious mind when her rational, skeptical defenses were down. In the dreams, Sarah and Emma would meet in various locations, sometimes a park that felt familiar but that Sarah couldn't place in her waking memory, sometimes a house that seemed like home even though Sarah had never seen it before, sometimes just an empty room with white walls where they could talk without any distractions or interruptions from the outside world. But these weren't fantasy dreams about imaginary adventures or magical experiences. Emma would share specific, verifiable information about her life, the name of her adoptive family, the town where she lived, the school she attended, even her current address. She described her adoptive parents in detail, their names, their jobs, their personalities, their quirks and habits. She talked about her bedroom, her friends, her fears and hopes and dreams for the future, with the kind of specificity that seemed impossible for Sarah's imagination to create. Emma told Sarah that her adoptive name was Emily Harrison, that she lived in Portland, Oregon, with parents who were both teachers. Michael taught high school history and Janet taught elementary school music. Emily described their house in detail, a blue two-story colonial with white trim, a front porch with a swing that squeaked when you rocked on it, and a backyard with an old oak tree that had a rope swing hanging from the lowest branch. According to Emma, they were identical twins who had been separated at birth and placed with different families through a Catholic adoption agency that deliberately split up siblings to ensure they could never find each other. The agency believed that twins had unhealthy psychological dependencies on each other and that separating them would give each child better individual opportunities for normal development. Sarah initially dismissed these dreams as elaborate fantasy, the kind of detailed fictional world that creative teenagers sometimes construct when reality feels insufficient or disappointing, but the emotional intensity was overwhelming. She would wake up feeling like she'd actually spent hours with her sister, and the grief of separation felt as real as any loss she'd ever experienced. The dreams became so frequent and so emotionally powerful that they started affecting Sarah's waking life. She became depressed, distracted, and obsessed with the possibility that Emma might actually exist somewhere in the real world. Sarah's grades started slipping because she couldn't concentrate on schoolwork when she was spending so much mental energy processing these intense dream experiences. She lost interest in activities she'd previously enjoyed because everything felt less real and less important than her relationship with Emma. Sarah's parents became increasingly concerned about her mental health. They suggested therapy, thinking that perhaps Sarah was using Emma as a way to avoid dealing with teenage social anxieties or academic pressures. But Sarah couldn't explain to them that Emma felt more real and more important than anything else in her life without sounding like she was having a psychological breakdown. The dreams became incredibly specific and detailed. Emma would describe her daily routine, what she ate for breakfast, which classes she was taking, what books she was reading, what movies she'd seen recently. She would talk about her friends by name, describing their personalities and the dynamics of their relationships with the kind of detail that suggested real, social interactions rather than imaginary scenarios. Emma told Sarah that she was having dreams about Sarah too, and that she'd been having these dreams since childhood. According to Emma, she'd grown up with an imaginary friend named Sarah, spelled without the H, who had the same personality, interests, and detailed backstory that Sarah had created for Emma. They had both been living parallel lives, connected by some invisible psychological thread that allowed them to share experiences across hundreds of miles of physical separation. The most convincing detail was that many of their shared imaginary memories were actually real experiences they had somehow lived together psychically. Emma would reference conversations they'd had, games they'd played, and emotional support they'd given each other during difficult times. And Sarah would remember all of these interactions as if they had actually happened. Finally, when Sarah was 18 and about to graduate from high school, She decided she had to investigate Emma's claims, even if it meant discovering that she'd been living in an elaborate delusion for over a decade. Using the information from her dreams, she searched online for Emily Harrison in Portland, Oregon, specifically looking for someone who matched Emma's descriptions of her adoptive family and living situation. What she found shocked her to the core. There actually was an Emily Harrison living at the exact address Emma had described, attending the high school Emma had mentioned, with adoptive parents whose names and professions matched Emma's descriptions perfectly. Michael Harrison was indeed a history teacher at Jefferson High School, and Janet Harrison taught music at Woodstock Elementary. They lived in a blue colonial house with white trim on Elm Street, just as Emma had described. Sarah spent weeks trying to work up the courage to make contact. What if Emily had no idea she was adopted? What if Sarah was completely wrong about everything and was about to traumatize some random stranger, based on elaborate dreams that were really just psychological fantasies? What if Emily thought Sarah was stalking her or trying to scam her family in some way? But finally, the need to know overcame her fears. Sarah crafted a carefully worded email explaining her situation and asking if Emily had ever felt like she had a missing sister or had experienced unusually vivid dreams about a twin. She tried to strike a balance between being honest about her experiences and not sounding completely insane to someone who might have no context for understanding what she was talking about. Emily's response came within hours, and when Sarah opened the email, she started crying before she even finished reading the first sentence. "Oh my God, Sarah, I've been dreaming about you my entire life. I knew you were real. I knew somewhere out there I had a sister who was looking for me too." Emily's email was long, detailed, and emotionally overwhelming. She described having the same kind of relationship with her imaginary friend Sarah that Sarah had experienced with Emma. She'd grown up feeling like she was missing a crucial part of herself, like there was another person who should be sharing her experiences but who was somehow absent from her life. Emily had also been having increasingly vivid dreams about Sarah throughout her teenage years, dreams where they would meet and talk and share details about their separate lives. She'd learned Sarah's full name, her adoptive family's information, and even specific details about Sarah's childhood, experiences that she couldn't possibly have known through any normal means. The reunion took place 2 months later when Emily flew to Ohio to meet Sarah in person. They arranged to meet at a coffee shop near Sarah's house, both of them nervous and excited and terrified that the reality might not live up to the intense emotional connection they'd shared through dreams and imagination. The moment they saw each other, both women started crying, not just because they looked identical, which they did, but because being together felt like coming home after 18 years of exile. They had the same mannerisms, the same laugh, even the same unconscious habits like pushing their hair behind their left ear when they were nervous or touching their nose when they were thinking carefully about something. But the really mind-blowing part was comparing their life experiences. Emily had grown up with an imaginary friend named Sarah, without the H, who had the same personality, interests, and detailed backstory that Sarah had created for Emma. They had both been having the same dreams about meeting each other, and many of their shared imaginary memories turned out to be real experiences they had somehow shared psychically across the distance. They spent hours comparing notes about their childhood imaginary friends and discovered that the details matched with impossible precision. Sarah's Emma and Emily's Sarah had the same favorite foods, the same fears, the same preferences for games and activities. They had both provided emotional support during difficult times, celebrated successes, and offered comfort during periods of loneliness or confusion. When Sarah and Emily investigated their adoption records, they discovered that they had indeed been identical twins separated at birth by a Catholic agency that believed splitting up siblings would give them better individual opportunities. The St. Vincent's Home for Children had a policy of separating multiple births because they believed that twins and triplets developed unhealthy codependencies that prevented normal social development. The agency had deliberately falsified records to prevent the families from ever discovering the truth about the children's biological siblings, and had even moved one of the babies to a different state to ensure permanent separation. The nuns who ran the agency believed they were acting in the children's best interests by preventing them from forming what they considered to be psychologically unhealthy attachments to their biological twins. When they finally located their biological mother, Maria Santos, she confirmed that she had given birth to identical twin girls and had been told by the nuns that the babies would be placed together with a loving Catholic family who desperately wanted children but couldn't have their own. Maria had spent 36 years believing her daughters were living together somewhere, never knowing they had been deliberately separated by the very people she had trusted to keep them united. Maria had been 16 when she gave birth, unmarried, and completely unable to care for two babies on her own. The nuns had convinced her that adoption was the only responsible choice, and that her daughters would have better opportunities if they were raised by an established family with financial stability and strong Catholic values. The reunion with their biological mother was emotionally complex and difficult. Maria was overjoyed to meet her daughters, but devastated to learn that they had been separated and had spent their entire childhoods feeling incomplete. She felt betrayed by the adoption agency and guilty about not fighting harder to keep them together, even though she had been just a teenager with no resources or support. Sarah and Emily now live in the same city. They both moved to Seattle and work in related fields. Sarah became a social worker specializing in adoption services, and Emily became a therapist who focuses on family reunification and sibling relationships. They maintain the kind of close relationship that most siblings never develop even when they grow up together, partly because they spent 18 years getting to know each other through dreams and imagination. They often joke that spending 18 years as each other's imaginary friend was perfect preparation for being real sisters. They already knew everything about each other's personality, preferences, fears, and dreams. They had already provided each other with emotional support through difficult times and had already learned how to communicate in ways that felt natural and effortless. The experience has made both women passionate advocates for keeping siblings together in adoption placements. They've testified before state legislatures about the importance of sibling bonds, spoken at adoption conferences about the psychological impact of separating children from their biological brothers and sisters, and helped dozens of other separated siblings reconnect with each other. Their work is based on the belief that family bonds are stronger than any human system designed to separate people, and that love will eventually find a way to reunite people who belong together. They've seen too many cases of siblings who spent years searching for each other, often guided by dreams, intuitions, and feelings of incompleteness that couldn't be explained through normal psychological theories. We spent 18 years proving that identical twins share more than DNA, Emily often says during their presentations at adoption conferences. We share consciousness, dreams, and a connection that can't be broken by distance, time, or deliberate interference. Love is the strongest navigation system ever created. Sarah and Emily's story has been featured in several documentaries about separated twins and has contributed to research about the psychological connections between siblings. Their case is often cited as evidence that family bonds operate according to principles that science doesn't fully understand, and that the emotional connections between relatives can transcend physical separation in ways that seem almost supernatural. The twins continue to have occasional shared dreams, though not as frequently as they did during their teenage years. They interpret these experiences as evidence that their psychological connection remains strong and that their years of separation have only strengthened their ability to communicate through nonverbal, non-conscious channels. Both women are now married and have children of their own, and their kids are being raised as cousins who understand that their mothers shared an unusual and special bond that helped them find each other against impossible odds. Sarah and Emily are determined that the next generation will grow up understanding the importance of family connections and the power of love to overcome any obstacle. Family isn't just about shared genetics. Sometimes it's about shared dreams, shared consciousness, and connections that transcend physical separation to guide people home to each other. This story is going to sound like something out of a movie, but it's documented in military archives, family letters, and testimonies from multiple witnesses who were there when it happened. It involves a young woman who had never met her grandfather, who died before she was born, but who received specific information about his fate through dreams that led to solving a 60-year-old military mystery and bringing closure to an entire family. Lisa Shun grew up in San Francisco, knowing almost nothing about her paternal grandfather except that he had been a Chinese-American soldier who died during World War II somewhere in the Pacific Theater. Her father rarely talked about his father, and when he did, it was always with pain and frustration. Grandfather had simply vanished during a military operation in 1944, and the family had never learned what happened to him, where he died, or even where his body might be buried. The official military notification had said only that Private Chun Wei-Ming was missing in action, and presumed dead after his unit was ambushed during a reconnaissance mission in the Philippines. No body had ever been recovered, no personal effects returned to the family, no detailed explanation provided about the circumstances of his disappearance. For nearly 6 decades, the Chun family had lived with the agonizing uncertainty of not knowing their patriarch's fate. This kind of bureaucratic limbo was unfortunately common for families of soldiers who disappeared during World War II, especially in the chaotic final stages of the Pacific Campaign. The military was dealing with massive logistical challenges, incomplete record keeping, and the reality that many battles were fought in remote locations where recovering bodies was simply impossible. Families like the Chuns were left with form letters, expressing official regret and very little actual information about what had happened to their loved ones. Lisa had grown up feeling disconnected from her Chinese heritage, partly because her grandfather's death had created such a painful void in the family's story. Without his presence, without his stories and memories, much of their cultural identity had been lost. Her father had immigrated to America as a child and had deliberately distanced himself from Chinese traditions because they reminded him too much of the father he'd barely known and would never see again. But when Lisa turned 25, the same age her grandfather had been when he disappeared, she began having incredibly vivid dreams about a man she'd never met but somehow recognized as family. In the dreams, she was following this soldier through dense jungle terrain, watching him participate in military operations that seemed both historically accurate and emotionally immediate. The soldier in her dreams looked exactly like an older version of Lisa's father, same facial structure, same way of walking, even the same habit of touching his left ear when he was thinking carefully about something. In the dreams, Lisa understood that this was her grandfather, and that he was trying to show her something important about what had happened to him during the war. The dreams were remarkably specific and detailed. Lisa saw her grandfather's unit setting up camp in particular locations, witnessed conversations between specific soldiers, and observed military equipment and procedures with accuracy that seemed impossible for someone with no military knowledge or historical training. She dreamed about the weight of his pack, the smell of jungle humidity, the exact sound of different weapons being fired, even the taste of the rations he ate. Lisa found herself experiencing these dreams from her grandfather's perspective, feeling his emotions and thoughts during crucial moments of his final mission. She felt his homesickness for his young wife and infant son back in San Francisco, his determination to complete his mission despite growing danger, and his deep love for the family he was fighting to protect and might never see again. But the most significant dream was different from all the others. Instead of just observing her grandfather's military service, Lisa found herself communicating directly with him. In the dream, they were sitting together in a jungle clearing, and he was speaking to her in a mixture of English and Chinese that she somehow understood perfectly, even though Lisa spoke very little Chinese in her waking life. Her grandfather told her that he had not died in the ambush as the military had reported. Instead, he had been captured by Japanese forces and taken to a prison camp on a small island that the Americans didn't know existed. He had survived for several months in the camp before dying of illness and malnutrition, but his body had been buried in a specific location that he described to Lisa in detail. In the dream, her grandfather gave Lisa precise directions to find his burial site, not just the island's location, but specific landmarks, distances, and geographical features that would help identify the exact spot where he was buried. He also told her about personal items that had been buried with him, including a letter he had written to his family but never been able to send, and a small jade pendant that his own father had given him before leaving China. Most remarkably, Lisa's grandfather told her the names of other American soldiers who had been imprisoned with him, men whose families had also never learned their fate. He described their faces, their personalities, their final messages for their loved ones, and the locations of their graves. It was as if he was providing information not just about his own death, but about the unresolved grief of multiple families who had spent decades wondering what had happened to their missing relatives. When Lisa woke up from this dream, she felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of the information she'd received. Everything had seemed so real, so specific, that she felt morally obligated to investigate, even though she knew it sounded completely insane. How could she contact military authorities and tell them she'd learned the location of missing World War II soldiers through conversations with her dead grandfather in dreams? But the details were too specific to ignore. Lisa spent months researching World War II military records, trying to find any information that might corroborate what she'd learned in her dreams. She contacted veterans organizations, military historians, and genealogy researchers, piecing together fragments of information about her grandfather's unit and their final mission in the Philippines. Eventually, Lisa connected with Dr. Michael Torres, a military historian who specialized in missing American servicemen from World War II. When she described her grandfather's case and the information she'd received through dreams, Dr. Torres was initially skeptical but professionally curious. The details Lisa provided matched some fragmentary intelligence reports about Japanese prison camps that had never been fully investigated. Working together, Lisa and Dr. Torres identified the island her grandfather had described, a small, uninhabited location in the southern Philippines that had indeed been used as a Japanese military outpost during the war. Satellite imagery showed geographical features that matched Lisa's descriptions, and historical research confirmed that American soldiers had gone missing in that area during the time period Lisa had specified. Dr. Torres was intrigued enough by Lisa's information to organize a preliminary investigation. Using ground-penetrating radar and archaeological techniques, they located what appeared to be burial sites in the exact location her grandfather had described. The radar images showed multiple graves arranged in a pattern that suggested organized burials rather than hasty battlefield interments. In 2003, nearly 60 years after her grandfather's disappearance, Lisa joined a military recovery expedition to the island. Using the directions she'd received in her dream, the team located what appeared to be a burial site in the exact location her grandfather had described. When they excavated the area, they found the remains of 4 American soldiers, along with personal effects that confirmed their identities. One of the bodies was positively identified as Private Chun Wei-Ming through dental records and DNA analysis. Just as Lisa had dreamed, he was buried with a jade pendant and a letter written in Chinese that was addressed to his family in San Francisco. The letter, remarkably preserved despite 6 decades in tropical soil, contained messages of love for his wife and young son, along with specific instructions about family traditions he wanted them to maintain in his memory. The letter was incredibly emotional and detailed. Chun Wei-Ming had written about his hopes for his son's future, his regrets about not being there to watch him grow up, and his determination to somehow find a way to communicate his love even from beyond death. He had included specific details about family history, cultural practices, and personal memories that only he could have known, providing proof of identity that went beyond physical evidence. The other 3 soldiers were also identified using information Lisa had received in her dreams. Their families were notified, and after decades of uncertainty, these men were finally given proper military burials with full honors. Lisa's grandfather's dream guidance had not only solved the mystery of his own fate, but had provided closure for 3 other families who had been living with the same agonizing questions about their missing relatives. The recovery expedition made national news, and Lisa became something of a celebrity in the military genealogy community. But she always insisted that she had been just a messenger, carrying information that her grandfather had somehow managed to preserve and transmit across 60 years of death and distance. She said the experience had taught her that love and determination could survive even the most impossible circumstances. Lisa's father was finally able to have his father's remains returned to San Francisco, where Private Chun Wei-Ming was buried with full military honors in the Chinese section of Cypress Lawn Cemetery. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including relatives of the other soldiers whose remains had been recovered through Lisa's dream guidance, and veterans who wanted to honor a man whose service had finally been acknowledged, and whose sacrifice had finally been properly memorialized. After the funeral, Lisa's father began sharing stories about his father that he had kept to himself for 6 decades. And the family started reconnecting with their Chinese heritage in ways that honored their grandfather's memory. Lisa learned Chinese, began studying her family's genealogy, and eventually started a nonprofit organization that helps families of missing servicemen investigate unresolved cases. The organization uses a combination of traditional research methods and what Lisa calls intuitive investigation, taking seriously the dreams, visions, and strong feelings that family members report about missing relatives. Lisa has found that family connections often provide information that can't be obtained through conventional research, and that emotional bonds between relatives can sometimes survive death and distance in ways that seem to defy normal understanding. Over the past 20 years, Lisa's organization has helped recover the remains of dozens of missing servicemen and has provided closure for hundreds of families who had spent decades wondering about the fate of their loved ones. The organization's success rate is remarkably high, partly because Lisa has learned to recognize the difference between wishful thinking and genuine psychic guidance, and partly because she's developed networks of researchers who are willing to investigate leads that might seem unconventional to traditional military historians. Lisa often speaks at military conferences and veterans events about the importance of taking family intuition seriously when investigating cases of missing servicemen. She argues that the emotional connections between relatives can provide information that survives even when official records are lost or incomplete, and that families often possess knowledge about their missing relatives that they don't consciously realize they have. "My grandfather spent 60 years trying to come home," Lisa often says when she speaks about her experience. Death didn't stop him from completing that mission, it just took him longer than expected. Love doesn't recognize the boundaries between life and death when it comes to protecting family and making sure nobody is forgotten. The Chen family case has been featured in several documentaries about missing servicemen and has contributed to changes in how the military investigates cases of soldiers who remain unaccounted for from past conflicts. Lisa's story is often cited as evidence that families should be considered important sources of information about missing relatives, and that unusual sources of guidance shouldn't be dismissed without investigation. Lisa never married or had children of her own, but she always said her real family was the network of military families she helped reconnect with their missing relatives. She believed that her grandfather had somehow reached across decades and death to guide her toward her true purpose, not just finding his own remains, but helping other families find closure and peace after years of uncertainty and grief. Sometimes the dead don't rest until their stories are told. Their families are healed and their brothers in arms are brought home with honor. In 1971, a teenage mother named Rebecca Martinez gave birth to septuplets, 7 babies, at a hospital in El Paso, Texas. The multiple birth was considered a medical miracle. But Rebecca was only 16 years old, unmarried, and completely unable to care for 7 children. The Catholic adoption agency that handled the placement made a decision that seemed practical at the time but was actually devastating. They separated the 7 siblings and placed them with different families across the American Southwest, ensuring that none of the children would ever know they had 6 brothers and sisters. The agency believed that placing 7 siblings together would be impossible, and that splitting them up would give each child better individual opportunities for adoption and success. They deliberately falsified records to prevent the families from ever discovering the truth, and they spread the children across Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California to make sure they would never accidentally encounter each other. The 7 children, 4 boys and 3 girls, grew up as only children or with non-biological siblings, never knowing that somewhere in the world they had 6 other people who shared their DNA, their birthday, and their origin story. They developed different personalities, different interests, different life paths, But they all grew up with a persistent sense that something was missing, that their families felt somehow incomplete. What makes this story absolutely extraordinary is that all 7 siblings, despite living in different states and growing up in completely different environments, began having similar dreams during their teenage years. They all dreamed about being in a circle with other children who looked like them, holding hands and feeling more complete and happy than they ever felt in their waking lives. Miguel, who grew up in Phoenix with a loving family who owned a small restaurant, dreamed about 6 other teenagers standing with him in a circle in what appeared to be a playground. The other children in the dream had his same dark hair and brown eyes, but different personalities and mannerisms. In the dream, they would introduce themselves by name, and Miguel would wake up remembering specific names like Carlos, Maria, Sofia, Antonio, Elena, and David. The dreams felt more real than real life to Miguel. He could feel the warmth of the other children's hands as they held the circle, could hear their distinct voices and laughter, could sense their individual personalities even though he'd never met any of them. He would wake up feeling homesick for people and places he'd never actually known, with an aching sense of loss that he couldn't explain to his adoptive parents. Sofia, who grew up in Albuquerque with parents who were both teachers, had essentially the same dream, standing in a circle with 6 other teenagers who felt like family in a way her adoptive siblings never had. She dreamed about specific conversations with children named Miguel, Carlos, Maria, Antonio, Elena, and David, and she woke up feeling homesick for people and places she'd never actually known. The remarkable thing about Sofia's dreams was their emotional intensity and consistency. She would dream about these siblings several times a week, and each dream added new details about their personalities, their interests, and their lives. She began to feel like she knew these children better than her own classmates, even though they existed only in her dreams. All 7 siblings reported similar dreams with remarkable consistency, the same circle formation, the same sense of belonging, the same names, even the same playground setting. They were dreaming about each other with accurate physical descriptions and personality traits, despite having been separated since birth and having no conscious knowledge of each other's existence. Carlos, who had grown up in San Antonio with a military family, began keeping a dream journal when he was 15 because the dreams about his 6 siblings were so vivid and consistent that he wanted to document them. He recorded detailed descriptions of each sibling's appearance, personality, and the conversations they had in their dream meetings. When he later met his real siblings, his dream descriptions proved to be remarkably accurate. Maria, who grew up in Tucson with a large adoptive family, had dreams that were so emotionally powerful that they began affecting her waking life. She would find herself searching crowds for faces that matched the siblings from her dreams. And she developed an obsession with large families because being around groups of related children made her feel less lonely. Antonio, Elena, and David, scattered across Arizona, New Mexico, and California respectively, all reported similar dream experiences. They would meet in the same imaginary playground, form the same circle, and share conversations and experiences that felt more real than their actual daily lives. Each sibling developed detailed knowledge about the other's personalities, interests, and even their adoptive family situations, all based on information shared in dreams. The breakthrough came in 1995 when Carlos, who had grown up in San Antonio, decided to search for information about his biological family. He hired a private investigator who specialized in adoption cases, hoping to find his birth mother or learn something about his medical history. The investigator discovered that Carlos was not just adopted, but was one of septuplets who had been deliberately separated and placed with different families. Using this information, the investigator began searching for Carlos's 6 siblings. The process took 2 years, but eventually she located all 7 children, who were now adults in their mid-20s. When she contacted each of them to explain the situation, their responses were remarkably similar. They all said they had been dreaming about their siblings their entire lives and had somehow known that they had family members somewhere in the world. The first reunion took place in 1997 at a park in Santa Fe, New Mexico, chosen because it was geographically central to where all 7 siblings lived. When they met in person for the first time since birth, The emotional impact was overwhelming. Not only did they look remarkably similar despite being raised in different environments, but their interactions felt like continuing conversations they had been having in dreams for years. Miguel later said that meeting his siblings felt like waking up from a 26-year dream, except that the dream had been his waking life and reality was finally beginning when he held hands with his brothers and sisters in an actual circle, just as they had been doing in their shared dreams. The siblings discovered that their dream meetings had been incredibly accurate. The personalities they had perceived in dreams matched their real siblings' actual personalities. The conversations they had shared in dreams reflected real interests, concerns, and life experiences. Even physical details like Carlos's scar from a childhood accident and Elena's distinctive laugh had been accurately represented in their shared dream experiences. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery was that the siblings had been unconsciously coordinating their lives based on information shared in dreams. They had all chosen careers in helping professions. Miguel became a nurse, Sofia a teacher, Carlos a social worker, Maria a counselor, Antonio a firefighter, Elena a therapist, and David a pediatrician. They had all remained single longer than average, as if waiting for something or someone they couldn't identify. The siblings also discovered that they had been having synchronized dream experiences throughout their lives. On nights when one sibling was dealing with a particularly difficult situation, the others would dream about providing support and comfort. During major life events like graduations or illnesses, all 7 siblings would have dreams about celebrating or grieving together, even though they had no conscious knowledge of what was happening in each other's real lives. When they investigated their adoption records, they discovered that the Catholic agency had deliberately falsified information to prevent the families from ever discovering the truth. Each adoptive family had been told that their child was an only child whose birth mother had died shortly after delivery. The agency had created elaborate false histories to ensure that no one would ever search for siblings who weren't supposed to exist. Rebecca Martinez, their biological mother, had been told that her babies had died during delivery due to complications from the multiple birth. She had spent 26 years grieving the loss of 7 children who were actually alive and thriving in adoptive families across the Southwest. When the siblings finally located her, the reunion was emotionally devastating and healing at the same time. Rebecca said that she had been having dreams about her children throughout the years since their birth. Dreams where she could see them growing up in different families but always feeling incomplete. She had developed severe depression and had spent decades believing that she was being punished for giving up her children, not knowing that they were alive and searching for each other. The 7 siblings now live within a few hours' drive of each other in New Mexico and maintain the kind of close relationship that most siblings never develop even when they grow up together. They meet regularly for family gatherings, vacation together, and have created the large, loving family that they had all been dreaming about their entire lives. They've also become advocates for keeping siblings together in adoption placements. Their story has been featured in documentaries, academic studies, and adoption reform literature. They testify before state legislatures about the importance of sibling bonds and the psychological damage that can result from unnecessarily separating children from their biological brothers and sisters. The siblings established a nonprofit organization that helps separated siblings find each other, guided by the belief that family connections are stronger than any human system designed to separate people. Their organization has facilitated hundreds of sibling reunions and has contributed to changes in adoption practices that prioritize keeping biological siblings together whenever possible. We spent 26 years proving that family bonds don't respect geographical boundaries. Bureaucratic decisions or deliberate interference, Carlos often says during their presentations. We found each other through dreams because love creates its own communication system that operates beyond normal physical limitations. The septuplets continue to have occasional shared dreams, though not as frequently as they did during their years of separation. They interpret these experiences as evidence that their psychological connection remains strong and that their years apart have only strengthened their ability to communicate through nonverbal, non-conscious channels. All 7 siblings are now married and have children of their own. and their kids are being raised as a large extended family, where cousins understand that their parents shared an unusual and special bond that helped them find each other against impossible odds. The next generation is growing up with a deep appreciation for family connections and an understanding that love can overcome any obstacle when people are determined to find each other. The story of the 7 Martinez siblings has become one of the most studied cases of separated siblings in adoption research. Their experience provides compelling evidence that family bonds operate according to principles that science doesn't fully understand, and that the emotional connections between relatives can transcend physical separation in ways that seem almost supernatural. Their case is often cited in debates about adoption practices, sibling rights, and the long-term psychological effects of family separation. The siblings' shared dream experiences have contributed to research about consciousness, telepathic communication, and the possibility that closely related individuals can maintain psychological connections across vast distances and extended periods of time. Family isn't just about shared genetics or shared upbringing. Sometimes it's about shared consciousness, shared dreams, and connections that transcend every obstacle that human institutions can create to keep people apart. Not all weird dream experiences happen when we're actually asleep. Sometimes they come from that strange twilight zone between consciousness and unconsciousness, where our minds seem to tap into information that our rational brains can't access. I read about this one case that honestly kept me up reading about it the other night, because it involves a mother whose nightmare literally saved her child's life. In 1989, a woman named Sarah Chun was sleeping peacefully in her modest 2-bedroom home in Loma Prieta, California, when she experienced what she later described as the most vivid and terrifying dream of her entire life. But calling it a dream doesn't really capture the intensity and realism of what Sarah experienced that night. She said it felt more like being physically transported to a future moment where she was watching her own life unfold in slow motion. Sarah was a practical, no-nonsense mother who worked as a bookkeeper for a local small business while raising her 8-year-old son Tommy as a single parent. She wasn't someone given to mystical thinking or supernatural beliefs. Her world revolved around concrete realities like paying bills on time, helping Tommy with his homework, and making sure they had enough groceries to last until her next paycheck. The Chain family had been living in their small house in the Santa Cruz Mountains for 3 years. It was a modest place, but it was theirs, and Sarah had worked incredibly hard to afford the mortgage payments. Tommy loved the house because his bedroom had built-in bookshelves that reached from floor to ceiling, packed with his growing collection of adventure novels and comic books. Sarah had installed those shelves herself, securing them carefully to the wall studs to make sure they were safe and stable. On the night of October 4th, 1989, Sarah went to bed feeling tired, but content after a normal evening of helping Tommy with his math homework and watching a movie together. She fell asleep easily and initially slept peacefully. But sometime around 2 a.m., she found herself in a dream that was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. In the dream, Sarah was standing in her living room when the entire house began shaking violently. But this wasn't like the minor earthquake tremors that were common in California. This was shaking so intense that she could barely keep her balance. The walls were swaying, the floors were rolling like ocean waves, and she could hear an enormous rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep underground. As the dream continued, Sarah watched in horror as her carefully organized home began falling apart around her. Pictures crashed off the walls, furniture slid across the floor, and windows cracked in spiderweb patterns. But what terrified her most in the dream was the sound coming from Tommy's bedroom, a loud, crashing noise followed by her son's voice calling for help. In the nightmare, Sarah ran toward Tommy's room, fighting against the violent shaking that made walking almost impossible. When she reached his doorway, she saw something that would haunt her for weeks afterward. The massive bookshelf that she'd so carefully secured to the wall had somehow broken free and toppled over directly onto Tommy's bed. She could see his small hand reaching out from under the heavy wooden structure, and she could hear his muffled voice calling, "Mommy, help me!" The dream was so realistic that Sarah could feel the texture of the wooden shelves as she desperately tried to lift them off her son. She could smell the dust and debris in the air, feel the continued shaking of the house, and hear the sounds of emergency sirens in the distance. She could even see specific details like Tommy's favorite stuffed elephant trapped under the bookshelf and his Spider-Man poster hanging askew on the wall. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the dream was Sarah's inability to move the bookshelf. No matter how hard she tried, no matter how she positioned herself, or how much strength she summoned, she couldn't lift the heavy wooden structure enough to free her son. She felt completely helpless and panicked, watching her child in danger and being unable to save him. Sarah woke up from this nightmare gasping and crying, her heart pounding so hard she thought she might be having a heart attack. The emotions felt absolutely real, the terror, the helplessness, the desperate need to protect her child. She immediately got up and checked on Tommy, who was sleeping peacefully in his bed, completely unaware of his mother's distress. Standing in Tommy's doorway, looking at him safe and sound in his bed, Sarah tried to convince herself that it had just been a stress-related nightmare. Single parenthood was challenging, and maybe her subconscious was processing fears about her ability to protect her son. But something about the dream felt different from normal anxiety dreams. It had been too specific, too detailed, and too emotionally realistic. For the next several days, Sarah couldn't shake the images from her dream. Every time she looked at the bookshelf in Tommy's room, she remembered the sound it had made crashing down and the sight of her son trapped beneath it. The memory was so vivid that she began questioning whether the bookshelf was really as secure as she'd thought. Despite feeling somewhat foolish, Sarah decided to take action based on her dream. She told Tommy that she wanted to redecorate his room and moved his bed to the opposite wall, away from the bookshelf. She also went to the hardware store and bought additional brackets to secure the bookshelf even more firmly to the wall studs. When Tommy asked why she was suddenly so concerned about his furniture, she made up a story about reading an article about child safety in the home. Sarah's husband had passed away 2 years earlier, so she didn't have a partner to discuss her concerns with. She considered calling her sister or her mother, but she was embarrassed about basing home safety decisions on a nightmare. Instead, she quietly made changes around the house to address the hazards she'd seen in her dream. In addition to moving Tommy's bed and reinforcing the bookshelf, Sarah also secured other heavy objects throughout the house, installed safety latches on kitchen cabinets, and created an emergency kit with flashlights, water, and first aid supplies. She told herself she was just being a responsible parent, but deep down, she was preparing for the specific disaster she'd experienced in her dream. Her preparations turned out to be prophetic. On October 17, 1989, just 2 weeks after her nightmare, the Loma Prieta earthquake struck Northern California with devastating force. At 5:04 p.m., Sarah was in the kitchen preparing dinner when the 6.9 magnitude earthquake began shaking the entire Bay Area. The earthquake was exactly as intense and terrifying as Sarah had experienced in her dream. The house shook so violently that she could barely stand. Pictures crashed off walls, and furniture slid across the floor just as she'd envisioned. The rumbling sound from underground was identical to what she'd heard in her nightmare, and the duration of the shaking seemed to last forever. When the earthquake finally stopped, Sarah's first thought was of Tommy, who had been in his bedroom doing homework. She ran to his room and found him shaken but unharmed, crouched under his desk just as they'd practiced during school earthquake drills. But what made Sarah's blood run cold was the sight of his former bed location. The massive bookshelf had indeed broken free from the wall and crashed down exactly where his bed used to be. The heavy wooden shelves, despite Sarah's additional reinforcements, had toppled over and smashed into the wall where Tommy's bed had been positioned just 2 weeks earlier. Books, toys, and shelf fragments were scattered across the floor in a pile. That would have seriously injured or killed anyone sleeping in that spot. Tommy looked at the destruction and said, "Mom, I'm so glad you moved my bed. That would have really hurt if I'd been sleeping there." Sarah just hugged her son tightly, overwhelmed with gratitude that her nightmare had prompted her to take action that saved his life. What I find fascinating about all these stories is how similar they feel to things people experience today. Like, I had a friend who once told me about having a vivid dream about a car accident that made her change her route to work. and she later found out there had been a collision at exactly the time and place she would have been driving. It makes you wonder how much of our dreaming experience is just human, you know? Stretching across centuries like this, invisible thread connecting us all to information we shouldn't be able to access. Speaking of dreams that prevented disasters, there's this story about a woman whose recurring nightmare about her own wedding day led to discovering a potentially deadly structural problem in one of England's most historic churches. And honestly, this one makes you wonder if our subconscious minds are better structural engineers than actual structural engineers. Margaret Thornton was planning what she thought would be the perfect wedding at St. Mary's Cathedral in York. One of those magnificent Gothic churches that makes you feel like you're getting married inside a fairy tale. The cathedral had been standing for over 800 years, had survived Viking raids, civil wars, and 2 world wars, so the idea that it might be structurally unsound seemed about as likely as the bride arriving on a unicorn. Margaret and her fiancé had booked the cathedral 2 years in advance because it was basically the most coveted wedding venue in northern England. The place was stunning, soaring stone arches, magnificent stained glass windows, and enough historical gravitas to make any wedding feel like a royal ceremony. Margaret had been dreaming about walking down that aisle since she was 12 years old. But starting about a month before the wedding, Margaret began having the same nightmare every single night. In her dream, everything looked exactly as she had envisioned it during their wedding planning. The church was decorated with white roses and baby's breath. The guests were seated in the polished wooden pews wearing their finest clothes, and James was standing at the altar looking handsome and nervous in his black tuxedo. But as Margaret began her walk down the aisle in the dream, she would start hearing an ominous creaking sound coming from somewhere high above. She would look up at the magnificent wooden ceiling with its elaborate carved beams and Gothic arches, and she would see something that filled her with absolute terror, hairline cracks, beginning to appear in the massive wooden structures that supported the roof. In her nightmare, the creaking would grow louder and more urgent as she continued walking toward the altar. The wedding guests would begin looking up nervously, pointing at the ceiling and whispering anxiously among themselves. But somehow, the ceremony would continue, as if everyone was hoping that ignoring the obvious danger would make it go away. The dream always climaxed at the moment when Margaret and James were exchanging vows. Just as the priest asked if anyone objected to their union, a section of the ancient wooden ceiling would give way with a sound like thunder. Margaret would watch in horror as massive wooden beams, carved stone ornaments, and chunks of plaster crashed down into the center of the church where their guests were seated. In her nightmare, Margaret could see specific people being trapped under the debris. She would see her elderly grandmother disappearing under a fallen beam, her young cousin screaming as stone fragments hit her, and her best friend trying frantically to shield her infant daughter from the falling debris. The beautiful Gothic cathedral would transform into a scene of chaos and destruction in a matter of seconds. The most disturbing part of Margaret's recurring dream was its incredible attention to detail. She could see exactly which section of the ceiling would collapse first, which beams would fall in which directions, and which pews would be hit by the heaviest debris. She could hear the specific sounds of wooden structures breaking, stone hitting wooden pews, and people screaming in terror and pain. After having this same nightmare for 5 consecutive nights, Margaret was exhausted, anxious, and beginning to question her sanity. She tried sleeping pills, chamomile tea, meditation, and even staying up all night to avoid dreaming, but nothing helped. Every time she fell asleep, she would find herself back in that church, watching her wedding day transform into a disaster. Finally, Margaret decided she had to tell James about her dreams. She was terrified that he would think she was having a nervous breakdown or that she was trying to find an excuse to postpone their wedding. But James was surprisingly understanding and supportive when she explained what had been happening. "Maggie," he said, holding her hands and looking directly into her eyes, "I know this sounds crazy, but what if your dreams are trying to tell us something important? I work in construction, and I know that old buildings can have structural problems that aren't obvious to the casual observer. Maybe we should have someone inspect the church." Margaret was relieved that James took her concerns seriously, but when they approached the church administration about their safety concerns, they were met with polite dismissal. Father O'Brien, the elderly priest who was scheduled to perform their ceremony, assured them that St. Mary's Cathedral was structurally sound and had been recently inspected by the diocese. "My dear child," Father O'Brien told Margaret, "you're just experiencing pre-wedding jitters. It's perfectly normal to have anxiety dreams before such an important life event. I've been conducting ceremonies in this church for 30 years, and I can assure you that it's completely safe." The church's wedding coordinator was similarly dismissive, pointing out that they had already paid substantial deposits for the ceremony and reception, sent out invitations, and made arrangements that would be expensive and embarrassing to change. "Hundreds of couples have been married in this church without incident," she said. "You can't cancel your entire wedding because of a bad dream." 3 days before the wedding, Margaret made a desperate decision. She and James drove to St. Mary's Cathedral and asked to meet with a structural engineer who could assess the building's safety. They offered to pay for the inspection themselves, explaining that they needed peace of mind before their wedding day. The engineer they hired, Robert Walsh, was initially skeptical about their concerns, but when he climbed up into the church's ceiling structure to examine the wooden beams, he discovered several serious problems that had been hidden from view. The wooden support beams were showing signs of stress and deterioration, and there were indications that the roof's weight distribution had shifted over the years due to settling in the building's foundation. "This is quite concerning," Walsh told Margaret and James after completing his inspection. "While the building isn't in immediate danger of collapse, there are several structural issues that should be addressed before this space is used for large gatherings. I'd recommend postponing any major events until these problems can be properly repaired." Margaret and James scrambled to find an alternative venue for their wedding, eventually settling on a beautiful garden location that, while different from their original plans, turned out to be even more perfect for their summer ceremony. Their wedding day was absolutely beautiful, with no structural disasters, ceiling collapses, or injured guests. 6 months later, during renovation work at St. Mary's Cathedral, workers discovered that the structural problems were even more serious than Walsh had initially identified. The wooden ceiling beams had been on the verge of catastrophic failure, and if the building had continued to be used for large gatherings, a collapse would have been nearly inevitable. The church's insurance company estimated that if the ceiling had collapsed during a wedding ceremony with 200 guests, the resulting injuries and fatalities would have been devastating. The exact section of the ceiling that Margaret had seen collapsing in her dreams was identified as the area most likely to fail first, and the pattern of debris that would have resulted from the collapse matched her nightmare visions with remarkable accuracy. Margaret's prophetic dreams had not only saved her own wedding day from tragedy, but had also prevented a disaster that could have injured or killed hundreds of people during future events at the cathedral. Her willingness to trust her dreams, despite social pressure and practical complications, had literally saved lives. Then there's this absolutely heartbreaking story that happened in 1966 in Wales, involving a little girl whose dreams tried to warn an entire village about a disaster that would change everything. This one's going to stick with you because it shows that sometimes the most innocent voices carry the most important messages, and sometimes the people who should be listening are too busy being adults to pay attention. Aromai Jones was 9 years old and lived in the small mining village of Aberfan in South Wales. She was the kind of bright, imaginative child that teachers loved, always asking questions, always curious about the world around her, always coming up with stories that were more creative than anything you'd find in children's books. Her parents, like most people in Aberfan, worked jobs connected to the coal mine that dominated their community and provided employment for nearly every family in the village. The landscape around Aberfan was defined by the mine, not just the underground tunnels where the men worked, but the massive waste tip that loomed above the village like a black mountain. For generations, trucks had been dumping mining debris onto this artificial hill, creating what was essentially a mountain of coal waste. Rocks and mud that grew larger every year. Everyone in the village was so accustomed to it that they barely noticed it anymore. It was just part of their world, like the mountains and the valley itself. But in the weeks leading up to October 21st, 1966, Aromai began having disturbing dreams about the waste tip. She would tell her mother about nightmares where the Black Mountain came alive and flowed down toward their village like a river of mud and rocks. In her dreams, she saw the tip sliding down the hillside, moving faster and faster, heading directly toward Panglass Junior School, where she and hundreds of other children spent their days. What made Aromai's dreams particularly unsettling was their emotional intensity and specific detail. She didn't just dream about generic danger or vague threats. She saw exactly how the disaster would unfold. She described the sound the sliding waste would make, the way it would flow around buildings, the specific route it would take through the village streets. She could see which houses would be hit first, which ones would be spared, and exactly how the school would be affected. The little girl told her mother, "Mummy, I dreamt I went to school and there was no school there." Something black had come down all over it. But her mother, like most adults, assumed these were just the kind of vivid nightmares that imaginative children sometimes have. Children often have fears about school. Maybe Aromai was processing anxiety about tests or social situations by dreaming about the school disappearing. But Aromai's dreams became more specific and more frequent as October 21st approached. She started talking about not being afraid to die, which was unusual and disturbing for such a young child. The day before the disaster, she told her mother something that would haunt the family forever. "I'm not afraid to die, Mummy. I'll be with Peter and June." Peter and June were two of her closest friends at school. On the morning of October 21st, 1966, Aromai woke up and told her mother about another dream. This time, she had dreamed that she was at school when everything went black. She said she couldn't breathe, couldn't see, couldn't call for help. But what was most disturbing about this final dream was that Aromai seemed calm about it, as if she had accepted what was coming. At 9:15 a.m., just as children were settling into their morning lessons at Panglass Junior School, a section of the coal waste tip became saturated with water from underground springs and recent heavy rains. The waste pile liquefied and began sliding down the mountainside toward the village, moving with unstoppable force and gathering speed as it descended. The landslide hit Panglass Junior School with devastating impact, completely burying the building under tons of black coal waste in a matter of minutes. 144 people died in the Aberfan disaster, including 116 children between the ages of 7 and 10. Aromai Jones was among those who died, along with her friends Peter and June, exactly as she had somehow known would happen. When rescue workers finally reached Aromai's body days later, they found her exactly as she had described in her final dream, surrounded by her closest friends, as if they had been comforting each other during their final moments. The three children were found together, holding hands, in what appeared to have been their classroom when the disaster struck. What makes this story even more remarkable is that Aromai wasn't the only child in the village who had been having disturbing dreams about the coal tip. After the disaster, investigators discovered that at least 12 other children had reported similar nightmares about the mine in the weeks leading up to the landslide. Multiple children had been trying to tell adults that something terrible was going to happen, but their warnings had been dismissed as childish fears or overactive imaginations. The Aberfan disaster led to major changes in how authorities handle community safety concerns, especially when those concerns come from unexpected sources. The tragedy demonstrated that sometimes children's intuitive understanding of their environment can be more accurate than adult expertise, and that dreams and premonitions should be taken seriously when they involve public safety. Aromai's story became a symbol of the innocence lost in the Aberfan disaster, but also of the mysterious ways that some people seem to sense approaching danger. Her dream suggests that children might have access to information about future events that adults have learned to ignore or dismiss as fantasy. In a world where we often tell children to stop being silly or imaginative, maybe we should be paying more attention to what they're trying to tell us about the world they see. There's this story that still gives me chills, and it involves not just dreams about finding relatives, but dreams that seem to bend time itself to bring families together across impossible circumstances. This one's about a Swiss clockmaker whose prophetic dreams didn't just show him the future, they showed him how to use time as a bridge between the living and the dead. In 1962, a 7-year-old boy named Timothy Mitchell in the countryside of Yorkshire, England, started telling his parents about his future memories, experiences that he described as remembering things that had already happened, but that nobody else remembered because they hadn't happened yet. Now that sentence alone is enough to make your brain hurt, but Timothy's way of describing these experiences was so matter-of-fact and innocent that it took his parents weeks to understand that their son was having what appeared to be prophetic visions with remarkable accuracy. Timothy was an ordinary child in most ways. He enjoyed playing with toy cars, reading adventure books, and exploring the fields and woods around their family farm. He was bright and curious, but not particularly unusual compared to other children his age. His parents, Robert and Eleanor Mitchell, were practical farming people who had little interest in supernatural phenomena or unexplained mysteries. But starting in the autumn of 1962, Timothy began having conversations with his parents that were unlike anything they had experienced. He would wake up in the morning and casually mention things like, "I remember when grandfather dies next spring," or "I remember the day when we get the new red car." When his parents asked him what he meant, Timothy would explain that he had dreams where he could see things that were going to happen. But in the dreams, it felt like he was remembering events that had already occurred. Timothy's future memories were incredibly specific and detailed. He described technological advances that wouldn't be invented for decades. He talked about people carrying small computers in their pockets that could show moving pictures and connect them to anyone in the world. He described watching movies on flat screens that hung on walls like pictures, and cars that could drive themselves without any person steering them. His parents assumed these were just the wild imaginings of a creative child who had been influenced by science fiction stories. But Timothy also described smaller, more immediate events that his parents could verify. He predicted the exact date his grandfather would die March 15, 1963, and described details about the funeral that proved accurate down to what flowers would be in the arrangements and who would attend the service. He predicted the day his baby sister would be born, several months before his mother even knew she was pregnant, and correctly described the complications that would occur during the delivery. What made Timothy's predictions particularly remarkable was the casual way he delivered them. He never seemed to think his future memories were unusual or supernatural to him. They were just another type of memory, like remembering what he had for breakfast or what game he had played the day before. He would mention future events in the same tone he used to talk about past experiences, as if time was just another dimension he could move through naturally. The local vicar, Reverend Williams, became interested in Timothy's case after the boy accurately predicted a fire that would destroy part of the village church. Timothy had described the fire in detail, which section of the building would be damaged, how the fire would start, and even which artifacts would be saved by quick-thinking parishioners. When the fire occurred exactly as Timothy had described, Reverend Williams began keeping a written record of the boy's predictions. Over the course of 2 years, Reverend Williams documented more than 200 specific predictions that Timothy made, ranging from global events like political changes and natural disasters to local occurrences like accidents and personal milestones in their community. The accuracy rate was extraordinary. Over 80% of Timothy's predictions eventually came true, and many of them included details that couldn't possibly have been guessed or deduced from available information. But here's where Timothy's story connects to our theme of family reunification through dreams. In 1964, when Timothy was 9 years old, he began having what he called connection dreams, visions where he could see people searching for lost family members and help them find each other across impossible distances. Timothy would dream about specific individuals who were looking for relatives, and he would somehow know exactly where those relatives could be found. Timothy's parents initially tried to discourage these predictions, worried that their son was developing some kind of psychological problem. But when Timothy started accurately predicting reunions between separated family members, often providing specific addresses and phone numbers for people he'd never met, his parents realized they were dealing with something far beyond normal childhood imagination. The most remarkable case involved a woman named Mary O'Sullivan from Dublin, Ireland, who had been searching for her brother Patrick for over 20 years. Patrick had emigrated to America after World War II and had lost contact with his family during the chaos of post-war immigration. Mary had spent decades writing letters to immigration offices, contacting Irish-American organizations, and even hiring private investigators, but she had never been able to find any trace of her brother. Timothy dreamed about Mary's search in vivid detail, even though he had never heard of her or her family. In his dream, he saw Mary sitting at her kitchen table in Dublin, writing letters and crying over old photographs of Patrick. But Timothy also saw Patrick, now calling himself Pete Sullivan, living in Chicago, working as a construction foreman and wondering every day whether any of his family back in Ireland was still alive. Timothy told his parents about this dream with his usual matter-of-fact delivery. There's a lady in Ireland looking for her brother Pete, and he lives at 1247 Oak Street in Chicago and works for Murphy Construction Company. She should call the company and ask for Pete Sullivan, but she needs to mention their father's pocket watch because that's how he'll know it's really his sister Mary. Timothy's father, being a practical man, was skeptical about acting on his son's dreams. But Timothy was so insistent and had been accurate about so many other predictions that Robert Mitchell decided to investigate. He contacted International Directory Assistance, found Mary O'Sullivan's phone number in Dublin, and called her to explain about his son's unusual ability. Mary was initially confused and suspicious about receiving a call from a stranger in England, claiming to know where her lost brother could be found. But when Robert mentioned specific details about Patrick's appearance and personality that Timothy had described in his dreams, details that only family members would know, Mary became convinced that this might be genuine. Mary called Murphy Construction Company in Chicago and asked to speak with Pete Sullivan. When Pete came to the phone, Mary mentioned their father's pocket watch, the one detail that Timothy had said would prove her identity. Pete immediately broke down crying because the pocket watch had been their father's most prized possession, and Pete had been carrying it with him since leaving Ireland over 20 years earlier. The reunion between Mary and Patrick took place 6 months later when Patrick flew to Dublin to meet his sister and the rest of his surviving family. Their emotional reunion was covered by local newspapers in both Ireland and Chicago, and Patrick credited the miraculous boy in England with reuniting him with the family he thought he'd lost forever. As Timothy grew older, his future memories became less frequent and less detailed. By the time he was 10 years old, the prophetic experiences had mostly stopped, and by age 12, they had disappeared entirely. Timothy himself didn't seem troubled by the loss of this ability, if anything. He seemed relieved to have his dreams return to normal childhood concerns like adventures and fantasies rather than glimpses of future realities. Timothy grew up to lead a completely ordinary life, working as an engineer and raising a family of his own. He remembered having the prophetic experiences as a child, but the memories felt distant and dreamlike, as if they had happened to someone else. He occasionally wondered if the experiences had been real or if they were elaborate childhood fantasies that had seemed real at the time. Throughout history, people tried to make sense of these dream experiences in completely different ways. And honestly, some of their explanations make modern dream therapy look like amateur hour. In ancient Egypt, they thought dreams like these were direct communications from the gods, which is kind of flattering when you think about it. Can you imagine if we still believe that today? Like your therapist telling you, well, clearly Ra is trying to tell you something about your relationship with your mother. The Egyptians were so serious about dreams that they built entire temples dedicated to dream interpretation, staffed by professional dream priests who charged premium rates for decoding nocturnal visions. They believed that certain dreams were prophetic messages from deities who were trying to guide human affairs from the afterlife. If you had a dream about finding a lost relative, Egyptian dream interpreters would tell you that the god, Thoth, was personally invested in reuniting your family and that you should follow the dream's guidance without question. Meanwhile, across the world in ancient China, they had this whole other idea that dreams were actually visits from the spirits of deceased ancestors who were trying to help their living descendants navigate important life decisions. Chinese dream philosophy held that family connections transcended death and that ancestors had both the ability and the responsibility to guide their families through dreams and visions. The Chinese developed elaborate rituals for communicating with ancestors through dreams, including specific foods to eat before sleep, particular sleeping positions that would encourage ancestral visitation, and detailed journal-keeping practices for recording and interpreting dream messages. If you dreamed about a lost relative, Chinese interpreters would tell you that your ancestors were actively working to reunite your family, and that you should prepare offerings of gratitude for their assistance. Ancient Greeks took a more philosophical approach, believing that dreams were glimpses into a parallel reality where all possibilities existed simultaneously. Greek philosophers like Plato argued that the dream world was actually more real than waking life because it showed the true, eternal forms of reality rather than the imperfect shadows we perceive while awake. Under this interpretation, dreams about finding lost relatives weren't predictions of future events. They were observations of events that were already happening in a more fundamental reality. The Greeks also developed the concept of therapeutic dreaming at temples dedicated to Asclepius, the god of healing. People would sleep in special chambers designed to encourage healing dreams, and temple priests would help interpret the visions as guidance for physical, emotional, and spiritual restoration. Many of these therapeutic dreams involved reconnection with lost loved ones as a crucial element of the healing process. Roman dream interpretation focused more on practical guidance for daily life, treating dreams as a form of divine consultation service. Romans believed that the gods used dreams to provide specific advice about business decisions, military strategies, and family matters. If a Roman citizen dreamed about finding a lost relative, dream interpreters would create detailed action plans based on the dream's content, treating the vision as divine instructions that should be followed precisely. Medieval Christian interpretations of dreams about family reunification were complicated by theological debates about whether such visions came from God, the devil, or natural psychological processes. Some Christian scholars viewed prophetic dreams as divine gifts similar to biblical prophecy, while others warned that dreams could be demonic deceptions designed to lead faithful Christians astray from proper religious devotion. Medieval monks developed sophisticated systems for distinguishing between godly dreams and demonic visions, based on factors like the emotional content of the dream, the moral character of the dreamer, and whether the dream's guidance aligned with Christian teachings. Dreams about finding lost relatives were generally viewed favorably because they promoted family unity and Christian love, but monks cautioned against placing too much emphasis on dream guidance rather than prayer and scripture. Indigenous cultures around the world developed their own unique approaches to understanding dreams about family connections. Many Native American tribes believed that dreams were sacred journeys undertaken by the soul while the body slept, and that these journeys could include visits to deceased relatives, glimpses of future events, and guidance for important life decisions. Some tribes practiced dream-sharing ceremonies where community members would gather to discuss their dreams and help each other interpret the messages they contained. Dreams about lost relatives were considered particularly significant because they suggested that the dreamer had special spiritual gifts that could benefit the entire community. Australian Aboriginal cultures developed the concept of dream time, a parallel reality where all events exist simultaneously and where the spirits of ancestors continue to influence the lives of their descendants. In Aboriginal understanding, dreams about finding lost relatives aren't predictions or visions. They're actual visits to the dream time where family connections transcend the limitations of physical death and geographical separation. Modern science has some interesting thoughts on all this, though honestly, it still feels like we're just scratching the surface of understanding dreams. Contemporary sleep research has identified several phenomena that might explain some aspects of dreams about family reunification, though none of these explanations fully account for the remarkable accuracy that some people report. One area of research focuses on genetic memory, the idea that certain information might be encoded in our DNA and passed down through generations. Some scientists theorize that adopted children might carry genetic memories that help them, recognize biological relatives, or feel drawn to specific locations where family members live, even without conscious knowledge of these connections. Another research direction involves studies of telepathic communication during sleep. Some experiments have suggested that people who are emotionally connected, like family members, might be able to share information through dreams in ways that can't be explained by normal communication channels. These studies are still controversial and haven't been replicated consistently, but they suggest that the human brain might be capable of receiving information through non-sensory means. Neuroscientists have also studied the role of the subconscious mind in processing information that doesn't reach conscious awareness. The theory here is that our brains are constantly receiving and analyzing subtle environmental cues, changes in electromagnetic fields, variations in air pressure, chemical signals that we can't consciously detect, and that this information sometimes surfaces in dreams as seemingly prophetic visions. Before we drift off for the night, let me share a few lesser-known dream stories that almost nobody talks about. Cases that are so strange and specific, they make you wonder if reality has more layers than we usually acknowledge during daylight hours. In 1962, a 7-year-old boy named Timothy Mitchell in the countryside of Yorkshire, England, started telling his parents about his future memories, experiences that he described as remembering things that had already happened, but that nobody else remembered because they hadn't happened yet. Timothy's way of describing these experiences was so matter of fact and innocent that it took his parents weeks to understand that their son was having what appeared to be prophetic visions with remarkable accuracy. Timothy was an ordinary child in most ways. He enjoyed playing with toy cars, reading adventure books, and exploring the fields and woods around their family farm. He was bright and curious, but not particularly unusual compared to other children his age. His parents, Robert and Eleanor Mitchell, were practical farming people who had little interest in supernatural phenomena or unexplained mysteries. But starting in the autumn of 1962, Timothy began having conversations with his parents that were unlike anything they had experienced. He would wake up in the morning and casually mention things like, "I remember when grandfather dies next spring," or "I remember the day when we get the new red car." When his parents asked him what he meant, Timothy would explain that he had dreams where he could see things that were going to happen, but in the dreams it felt like he was remembering events that had already occurred. Timothy's future memories were incredibly specific and detailed. He described technological advances that wouldn't be invented for decades. He talked about people carrying small computers in their pockets that could show moving pictures and connect them to anyone in the world. He described watching movies on flat screens that hung on walls like pictures, and cars that could drive themselves without any person steering them. His parents assumed these were just the wild imaginings of a creative child who had been influenced by science fiction stories. But Timothy also described smaller, more immediate events that his parents could verify. He predicted the exact date his grandfather would die, March 10th, 1963, and described details about the funeral that proved accurate down to what flowers would be in the arrangements and who would attend the service. He predicted the day his baby sister would be born, several months before his mother even knew she was pregnant, and correctly described the complications that would occur during the delivery. The local vicar, Reverend Williams, became interested in Timothy's case after the boy accurately predicted a fire that would destroy part of the village church. Timothy had described the fire in detail, which section of the building would be damaged, how the fire would start, and even which artifacts would be saved by quick-thinking parishioners. When the fire occurred exactly as Timothy had described, Reverend Williams began keeping a written record of the boy's predictions. Over the course of 2 years, Reverend Williams documented more than 200 specific predictions that Timothy made, ranging from global events like political changes and natural disasters to local occurrences like accidents and personal milestones in their community. The accuracy rate was extraordinary. Over 80% of Timothy's predictions eventually came true, and many of them included details that couldn't possibly have been guessed or deduced from available information. As Timothy grew older, his future memories became less frequent and less detailed. By the time he was 10 years old, the prophetic experiences had mostly stopped, and by age 12, they had disappeared entirely. Timothy himself didn't seem troubled by the loss of this ability. If anything, he seemed relieved to have his dreams return to normal childhood, concerns like adventures and fantasies rather than glimpses of future realities. Timothy grew up to lead a completely ordinary life, working as an engineer and raising a family of his own. He remembered having the prophetic experiences as a child, but the memories felt distant and dreamlike, as if they had happened to someone else. He occasionally wondered if the experiences had been real, or if they were elaborate childhood fantasies that had seemed real at the time. Then there's the story of Klaus Weber, a Swiss clockmaker who in 1923 started having the same dream every night for 6 months. In the dream, he was standing in his workshop when all of his clocks suddenly stopped working at exactly 3:17 a.m. Then he would hear a voice saying, "Time has run out for the clockmaker." Klaus wasn't just any ordinary craftsman. He was considered one of the finest clockmakers in all of Switzerland, whose timepieces were so precise they were used by observatories to calibrate their equipment. Klaus had inherited the clockmaking business from his father, who had learned the trade from his father before him. The Weber family had been making clocks for over 2 centuries, and Klaus took immense pride in continuing this tradition. He was known throughout the region for his meticulous attention to detail and his almost supernatural ability to diagnose problems with timepieces that other craftsmen couldn't repair. But this dream was unlike anything Klaus had ever experienced. Every night, without fail, he would find himself standing in his familiar workshop, surrounded by the gentle ticking and chiming of his beloved clocks. The workshop in his dream looked exactly as it did in real life. The same wooden workbenches covered with tiny gears and springs, the same tools hanging in perfect order on the walls, the same warm light filtering through the windows that overlooked the valley below. In the dream, Klaus would be working on a particularly complex clock movement, his skilled hands making the delicate adjustments that were second nature to him after decades of practice. But then, always at exactly 3:17 a.m. according to every clock in the workshop, something impossible would happen. Every single timepiece would suddenly stop working simultaneously. The gentle symphony of ticking that had provided the soundtrack to Klaus's entire life would cease instantly, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like death itself. Klaus began to dread going to sleep, knowing that he would once again experience the terrible moment when all time stopped in his world. He tried changing his bedtime, drinking warm milk, reading before sleep, even sleeping in different rooms of his house. Nothing worked. Every time he closed his eyes and drifted off, he would find himself back in that dream workshop, watching his life's work cease to function at exactly 3:17 a.m. The psychological impact of these dreams began affecting Klaus's waking life. He became obsessed with the time 3:17, checking his clocks constantly as that moment approached each morning and afternoon. He would find himself holding his breath as 3:17 arrived, half expecting all his real clocks to stop working just as they did in his dreams. Klaus also became increasingly focused on his own mortality and the passage of time. He had always been philosophical about the nature of time. It was impossible to work with clocks every day without thinking about how time moved and what it meant for human life. But his dreams intensified these contemplations to an almost unbearable degree. He began to see his clocks not just as beautiful mechanical objects, but as reminders of the relentless forward progress of time toward an inevitable ending. As the months passed, Klaus began to suspect that his dreams might be prophetic. He started making preparations that seemed rational to him but appeared strange to his family and friends. He wrote detailed letters to his wife and children, explaining his love for them and his gratitude for the life they had shared together. He organized his financial affairs with unusual thoroughness, making sure that every debt was paid and every important document was properly filed. Most remarkably, Klaus began carving his own headstone. He worked on it in secret in the back room of his workshop where he kept his rarest and most valuable clocks. Using the same precision and attention to detail that he brought to his timepieces, he carved an elaborate stone monument that included not just his birth date but also the exact date and time of his death, March 17, 1924, at 3:17 a.m., When his wife discovered the headstone, she was terrified and begged Klaus to see a doctor. She thought he might be having some kind of mental breakdown, perhaps brought on by working too long with tiny mechanical parts and spending too much time in solitude. But Klaus insisted that he was perfectly sane and that he was simply preparing for something he knew was coming. On March 17, 1924, exactly 6 months after the dreams had started, Klaus Weber died of a heart attack in his workshop. His apprentice found his body the next morning, slumped over his workbench with a half-finished clock movement in his hands, and every single clock in his workshop had stopped working at exactly 3:17 a.m. The local newspaper called it the most precisely predicted death in Swiss history. The authorities investigated the stopped clocks, wondering if someone had deliberately tampered with them as some kind of elaborate hoax. But experts who examined the timepieces found no evidence of interference. The clocks had simply stopped working simultaneously, as if responding to some invisible signal that only they could detect. Klaus's workshop became something of a local attraction after his death. People would come from neighboring villages to see the room where a man had predicted his own death down to the exact minute, and where dozens of clocks had mysteriously stopped at the moment of his passing. Some visitors reported feeling an unusual sense of temporal displacement in the workshop, as if time moved differently there than in the outside world. There's another story from the 1940s about a largely unknown artist named Maria Santos, who lived in a small fishing village on the coast of Portugal, where the rhythm of life was determined by the tides and the weather patterns that swept in from the Atlantic Ocean. Maria was a quiet, introspective woman who supported herself by painting portraits of local families and landscapes that captured the austere beauty of her coastal home. But every few months, Maria would have intensely vivid dreams about disasters, earthquakes that split the earth open like broken pottery, floods that swept away entire towns, fires that consumed forests and cities with equal hunger, and accidents that happened with such specific detail that she could see the expressions on people's faces in the moments before tragedy struck. These dreams were unlike anything else Maria experienced in her otherwise peaceful life. When these disaster dreams came to her, Maria would wake up with an overwhelming compulsion to paint exactly what she had seen. She would stumble from her bed to her easel, sometimes still wearing her nightgown, and begin painting with an intensity and skill that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her normal artistic abilities. She would work for hours without stopping, as if channeling visions from some other realm directly onto her canvas. Maria's disaster paintings were remarkably detailed and technically accomplished, far beyond what anyone expected from a village artist who had never received formal training. She painted specific buildings burning in cities she had never visited, bridges collapsing over rivers she had never seen, ships sinking in storms that showed weather patterns with meteorological accuracy. Her neighbors thought she was obsessed with tragedy and death, creating dark fantasies that had no place in their simple coastal community. The paintings showed not just the disasters themselves, but the human stories within them. Specific people fleeing from danger, families separated in chaos, rescuers working desperately to save lives. Maria would paint faces with such precision that they seemed like portraits of real individuals, even though she claimed never to have met any of the people who appeared in her disaster visions. Between 1943 and 1947, Maria created 43 disaster paintings based on her dreams. Her small house became crowded with these dark canvases, stacked against the walls like windows into possible futures. Local people found the paintings disturbing and morbid, wondering why someone would choose to spend their time creating such grim art when they lived in such a beautiful place. But as the years passed, something extraordinary began to happen. The disasters that Maria had painted started coming true with remarkable accuracy. A bridge in northern Spain collapsed during a flood, exactly as she had depicted it 2 years earlier. A passenger ship sank off the coast of Morocco in a storm that matched her painting down to the specific way the waves crashed over the vessel's deck. Buildings in various European cities burned in fires that followed the exact patterns she had shown in her art. 17 of Maria's disaster paintings came true with such precision that local newspapers began writing about the prophetic artist, who seemed to paint the future before it happened. Reporters would come to her village to interview Maria and photograph her paintings, trying to understand how an untrained artist in a remote coastal town could predict specific disasters in distant places with documentary accuracy. Maria herself was troubled by the attention and the growing realization that her dreams were somehow showing her real future events. She had initially thought the disaster paintings were just her imagination processing fears and anxieties, perhaps influenced by news reports about the war that was devastating Europe. But as more and more of her paintings proved to be prophetic, she began to understand that something far stranger was happening. The most haunting painting in Maria's collection was her last one, a scene of her own village being destroyed by flooding. She painted specific houses underwater, including her own small cottage where she had spent her entire life. She showed the local church with water up to its bell tower, the fishing boats swept inland and smashed against buildings, and specific people from her village fleeing to higher ground with expressions of terror and disbelief. Maria showed this painting to her neighbors and begged them to prepare for a flood that would be unlike anything they had ever experienced. She warned them about which areas would be hit hardest, which escape routes would be safe, and when they should evacuate based on the weather patterns she had seen in her dream. Most villagers were skeptical, pointing out that their town had never experienced major flooding and was protected by natural barriers that seemed to make such a disaster impossible. But Maria's reputation as a prophetic artist had grown, and some people took her warning seriously. They quietly made preparations, moving valuable possessions to higher ground, planning evacuation routes, and keeping emergency supplies ready. The local priest even held special prayers for protection from flooding, though he admitted he wasn't entirely sure he believed in Maria's visions. 3 months after Maria completed her final painting, an unexpected dam failure in the mountains above their village caused massive flooding that destroyed most of the town exactly as she had depicted. The disaster played out like a live-action version of her painting. The same buildings were submerged, the same escape routes proved safe, and even specific details like which trees would be uprooted and where debris would accumulate matched her artistic vision with impossible precision. However, because Maria had warned the villagers and some had taken her advice seriously, most people were prepared and evacuated to safety before the worst flooding occurred. Lives were saved because an artist had dreamed about tomorrow and painted what she saw, and because some people had learned to trust in the possibility that art could sometimes serve as prophecy. The flood destroyed Maria's house and most of her paintings, but the prophetic artwork that remained became treasured artifacts in the region. The paintings were eventually donated to a museum in Lisbon, where they are studied by researchers interested in the relationship between artistic inspiration and precognitive experiences. After the flood, Maria never painted another disaster scene. She said her dreams had fulfilled their purpose and she could finally sleep peacefully without visions of tragedy and destruction. She spent her remaining years painting flowers and landscapes, as if her subconscious had finished whatever work it needed to do through her art and could finally rest. Sometimes I wonder if the people in these stories ever realize how fascinating their dreams would be to strangers hundreds of years later. There's something kind of beautiful about that, isn't there? That the most private experience, our dreams, can somehow connect us across time, serving purposes we never consciously intended, guiding people toward reunions they didn't know they needed, and protecting families in ways that transcend our normal understanding of how love works in the world. If you're somehow still awake, which would honestly surprise me. You've just journeyed through some of the most documented cases of dreams serving as bridges between separated family members. From ancient times to the present day, from emperors to ordinary people, consciousness seems to occasionally transcend the normal boundaries of time and space to guide people home to each other. I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you've ever had a dream that led you to someone important, whether it was a family member, a friend, or just someone who changed your life in an unexpected way, drop it in the comments. These stories remind us that the connections between people who belong together might be stronger than any distance, any obstacle, or any amount of time. Maybe tonight, as you drift off to sleep, you'll visit that mysterious place where love creates its own navigation system. Maybe you'll dream about someone who needs to find you, or someone you need to find. And maybe, if you're lucky, you'll discover that the most powerful GPS ever invented isn't technology. It's the human heart reaching across impossible distances to guide people home. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy falling asleep to these strange journeys through the mysteries of human connection. We'll be back next week with another exploration of the weird, wonderful, and sometimes miraculous ways that dreams connect us across time, space, and the boundaries between the living and the dead. Sleep tight, and remember, sometimes our dreams know things our waking minds have forgotten. Sometimes love really does find a way. And sometimes the most impossible reunions happen because someone, somewhere, had the courage to follow a dream that seemed too strange to be true. See you in your dreams.